Can you bring me down just a little bit? Thank you, Chris. I sounded a little bit loud to me, so I don't know if it was a little bit loud to you or not. But thank you for being here. If you would open your Bibles to Exodus 3, we will eventually wind up there. We're taking a look at the events in the Exodus and not wanting to pass over the details. So to that point, there is my contact information. If you have a question over something in here that you're reading and say, well, what is this, or what's going on there, or how did that happen, or thing, I invite you to call me, text me, send me an email, or take one of the prayer cards and write a question down on there, and either hand it to me or drop it into the collection box. They'll get that to me that way. So whatever way, if you've got a question, I know a lot of times we are not supposed to ask questions or don't ask that question, but I would encourage you to ask those questions. I won't necessarily attribute it to you if you don't want me to, but I appreciate and like hard questions because that's how we learn. And I try to always tell classes, if it's an honest question, then absolutely, let's talk about it. One of my favorite podcasts, their tagline is "Know what you believe and why you believe it." So I would like to do that. Last week we introduced this, talking about the culture. I wanted to talk a little bit about the culture of Exodus and what was going on, and we talked about how the Egyptians were polytheist, that they, in the Egyptian religion, and the Egyptian culture lasted for about 3,000 years. 3,000 years. And so by the time that the 430 years that the Hebrews were in there, I mean, just think about those terms. We talk about the United States, we've only been here a couple of hundred years. They were in Egypt twice as long as that. And so that they were, Egypt was a polytheistic culture. They had somewhere, depending on who you look at, anywhere between 1,500 and 2,000 gods. And apparently they kept a list of them. Some of them were national, some of them were regional. But of course then the Hebrews had their stories about their God, the God. And we talked about, I introduced polytheism, we talked about monotheism, but then there's a couple of other words I ran across. Henotheism, which is, there may be other gods, but we only worship one, or monolatry, which is, we only worship one God in spite of the fact that there are many, that it's an acknowledgement that there are multiple gods, but we only choose one. And then John, who is not here, Jacob, where's your father-in-law? Is he teaching? Or is he? Okay. I may have to retell the story instead of having him tell it. John, we talked about, John brought up a question last week that I want to get into a little bit about what is a God? When we say the word God, what does that mean? And what do we mean when we say the word? When you see God or gods, so asking that question in this setting is a little bit different because we're here to worship. But as we use this term throughout our week, when you see God, what is a God? This is your part. Yes. Demons. Okay. Demons are gods.
Well, so that's other gods are kind of lowercase g are treated as if they exist in the Bible, right? Like that there are spiritual beings on this in this world that interact with us that are real, but they're not the real God. Like so, Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about that when the Gentiles sacrifice, they're sacrificing to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. Like he takes that as a real thing. Like so, when it's treated as like when they're making sacrifices to whatever Greek god or whatever Egyptian god, that's a sacrifice to a demon.
Okay, so false gods, as we would say, are demons,
Yeah.
and so but they're worshipped as gods. Okay, which comes back to what how do we define what are the characteristics of gods? What is that, Beth?
I think like growing up, I've always kind of knew this in the back of my mind, just listening to Greek mythology. If God was somebody that you thought had control over your life, or could make a change in your life for good or for bad. And so that was always my understanding of gods who were not our God.
Okay, coming out of Greek mythology, those beings could influence or have control of your life for good or for bad. And what determined whether it was
At
good or
their
bad?
own whim.
At their own whim. Okay.
I think they're also the things we give control over our lives.
Okay.
It's like the thing, to me, a God is anything that you choose to worship.
Okay. A God is anything that you choose to worship.
Ascribing worth to it, right?
Ascribing
It's
worth to it.
worthy.
You're kind of into this whole ascribing worth thing right now, aren't you?
Yeah.
And Larry, I think sometimes I think of worship, I see people enamored by, like Daryl said, somebody that plays basketball well. Why are we enamored with that? You know, or somebody that can act well, or somebody that's famous. And, you know, it's a fine line, but I see people essentially what I would call worshiping it. Now, they're not going to church, but their life is, I don't know, consumed by them, but they're very enamored, very focused, very in awe, can't even talk around them. Why?
Okay.
I think of that as a form of worship, and of course we do that with lots of things, not just people.
So we can worship those kinds of things and they're enamored, okay? So yeah, John?
We can think something's God-like, right?
Okay.
That's
God.
another twist of the word.
Uh-huh.
But for me, if you're going to say, what is a characteristic or a requirement for a God, I would say it has to be a being that existed prior to creation.
Okay.
Now, could there be gods that were made after creation? I mean, that I don't, that's above our pay grade. But something that exists outside of humanity, something that exists outside of the physical creation that we have, something that predates us. And I think we have examples in the Bible of people wanting to worship an angel because when they see it, they're like, oh my goodness, this is something so beyond me. And oftentimes the angel will say, hey, don't do that. That's not what I am. But I think I think sometimes we want to make gods things that we create, right? Things that I worship, that I've created myself, and we could come up with a long list of wealth and power and all of these kinds of, quote, gods. But I think it's important to recognize that there are entities and deities that existed before creation in addition to the Trinity.
Okay. So we're coming back to, you use some other words, entities, deities. And one of your definition of a God is that it existed before creation. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, eternal?
Outside of time, outside of this physical perspective that we have.
Okay.
Equate idol and God as the same thing?
would I equate idols and gods as the same thing? I think they're very closely connected, but not necessarily, because they're different in my mind, because an idol is something that represents a god. It's a physical representation of a non-physical thing. Does that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that passage in Isaiah. It talks about the carpenter makes things out of wood and then he worships it and then uses that same wood to make firewood.
Mm-hmm.
You know, doesn't see the difference. So he's like worshiping a God of his hands that he has made. It's something tangible he can grab onto. He's still, maybe he's using it to worship through to something else. I don't know, but.
Yeah, it depends on when you say an idol. Well, it's that painting that I've showed here before of painting of a pipe. And the phrase in the pipe says, the phrase that's written on the painting is, this is not a pipe. Well, it's not a pipe, it's an image of a pipe. The pipe is something you can put tobacco in and smoke, and you can't do that to the painting. So an idol, in my definition, an idol is that thing that is put on the shelf or on the stand or whatever, but not necessarily the deity that physical object represents. So do you have some other terms that you want? Yeah, Dale?
I was going to ask, are you asking the question, what we think the gods were for the past, or what they thought in the past were gods?
I am more asking, when you see this word, either one of those, when you see that word, what definitions come to your mind, especially outside of this time period on Sunday morning?
I've heard it said that you can look at somebody's checkbook and see what they're, what's important to them. Well,
Yeah.
we're spending all our money, our time on an object. Is that a god? I mean, I don't know, but, or on not just an object, on a thing, on a hobby, on a passion or whatever.
Yeah. Let me see if I ask this oh, yeah.
I think that the struggle that Catholics and Orthodox religions have had is over icons.
Mm-hmm.
Because one group believes this is just a representation of one of the saints.
Mm-hmm.
And the other says, no, it isn't. It's an idol.
Yeah. So we start getting into what's the difference between an icon and an idol, and there have been couple hundred years of discussion about that, at least a couple hundred. In our culture, let me come back, one of the words that John used. What's the difference between a God or is there a difference between a God and deity? Do those words hit you differently? And if so, how? Yeah?
God, the supreme or ultimate reality.
Okay.
And Miriam goes on in the second definition as a less commonly God, a being or object that is worshipped or having more than natural attributes and powers. And Miriam just goes on and on and on. There's about 6 of them. So.
Okay.
Well, God defines himself in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And that doesn't mean in front of me. Before me to a transcendent, eternal, infinite being means anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So God, by saying that, is saying, I'm the only one. And anything else that you have is an idol.
One of the other things that is said related to that is the commandment, the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. well, there must be other gods. If there was only one, so.
He's defining himself as
Yes. Yeah. Rachel?
I mean, it was a very foreign concept to have one God, at this time. And a lot of these, these gods or idols, whatever it would have been, they did, in much the way that we understand icons and saints, had specific purposes. And the having one God would have been very foreign to many people in that day. I mean, think about Laban and all of the, all of the people that Israel encounters, even before they end up in Egypt. They have all kinds of gods for fertility and livestock and, all of these different things. And so to merge that all into one would be bizarre, I would assume culturally, but then we're trying to do the reverse and apply our understanding of one God, to a people that would have been completely a foreign idea.
Part of what I want to introduce to you is you're going to see God and gods as you read through your Old Testament, and you're going to see that in the New Testament. But as you read your English translation, you're also going to see, not just at the beginning of the sentence, capital G-O-D, which is God. And as you read through Exodus, you're going to see God. But one of the things that that I want you to realize is when you see the capital G-O-D in Exodus and in the Old Testament, it is actually the Hebrew word Elohim, usually, which, strictly speaking, Elohim is plural. It would be gods. And so I want you to understand that anytime you're reading a translation of something, you are also reading in essence, a commentary, because to take a word from one language into another, you have to translate not just the word itself, but also the meaning of the word. I only speak one language. I have, of course, in Bible study and all, I've looked a lot at Hebrew, I've looked a lot at Greek. I took 2 years of Greek in college, and it was still a foreign language. I passed it, but I never became literate with it. I had to still have to have reference books out and look at it. But I always thought of a different language just using different sounds to represent what I knew. So and having lived in San Antonio, I learned that if I was down in the Hispanic part of town and I wanted to go to the bathroom, I would ask for the baños. It's a bathroom. It's a baños. Use whichever one you want. So I was looking at, and Debbie, you may have to help me out with this, but if I translate bathroom into French, did I write that down? Salle de bain. Am I saying that even close? Close. Salon? Salon de bain. Okay. But if you're in a restaurant and you ask for that, they're going to look at you and go, "You want to? We don't have showers in the restaurant, or bathrooms. You don't ask for it." Now, that is a strict translation into French. You're asking for the bathroom. You don't want a bathroom. You want to use the toilet. So it's not just translating the word, it's translating the meaning. And so when you're reading Exodus and you see capital G-O-D, the Hebrew word there is quite literally gods, plural. But the thing that doesn't translate into our English is the verbs where that is used is singular. Turn to Exodus. Where do I have that? First chapter. The first mention of God in the book of Exodus is actually with the midwives when the Pharaoh says, I want you to kill all the male babies. Exodus 1, verse 17, but the midwives feared. Let me read this without a literal translation. But the midwives feared gods and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Down in verse 20, so gods dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew strong, very strong. And because the midwives feared gods, he gave them families. In verses 20 and 21, in the Hebrew, what you have, so gods dealt, and that verb is singular. Also, and the midwives feared gods, he gave, again, singular. In English, that's like saying the boys runs to the parking lot. You don't do that. Boys run, not runs. So in the Hebrew, you've got this contradiction when it's referring to the gods of Abraham, that the word is plural, but it's used as a singular noun. Yeah. And so, but all my life growing up, I didn't really wrestle with that. I didn't understand that all that time when I saw God, what I saw and heard in my mind is God the Father. So all this was God the Father by himself. But all the times that you see this, as you read through Exodus, it's saying gods, plural. They're all there. They are multiple and one. And so our English translators are doing the same thing that the Jewish translators did when they tried to take the Hebrew and put it into Greek, because in the Septuagint, because the people were not in the dispersa were not learning Hebrew, but they did learn Greek. And they translated from the Hebrew into the Greek, and in these instances, they used the single noun in that translation, not the plural. John?
John's going to do the exact same thing in the beginning of his gospel to us. Mm-hmm. He's going to say, in the beginning was the Word, singular, and the Word was God, and the Word was with. Wait a minute, with? I'm not with myself.
Yeah.
The Word was with God. And everything happened through him. And nothing happened that didn't happen. So John is fleshing this out again, saying that God is God, made up of three. And that he were, boy, it's like they had pronoun problems back then too.
He, they, he. What,
yeah.
Uh-huh.
That was the challenge.
I will give you as I started working on this and trying to put this into my mind, the phrase I came up with is a plural singularity. Because it's plural and single at the same time. Yes.
Just to tag on to that, I always, before I realized Elohim was plural and all that, even as a kid, there's a verse we read all the time, and it never struck me until I made the connection. But even in Genesis 1, verse 26, it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Let them blah blah." And I never caught that before.
Yeah. What us? It's only been God there, God the Father. Who us? Yeah. So that concept has been there, and what I just want to challenge you to start, when you see that, to start thinking of, this is plural.
God was talking to Moses and said, tell them that I am sent you. I am. Which is that? Is that, I'm asking.
We're going to come there in a few minutes. You're about that far ahead of me.
Sorry.
No, that's good.
Larry,
Yes.
I'm gonna open a little can of worms, and I'm gonna close it real quick.
Just a little can of worms.
Because he says, let us make man in our own image. Does he mean man, or does he mean mankind? Does he mean, let's make Adam in our own image? Or does he mean, let's make mankind in our own image? Is there a plurality in creation? Is there a planned plurality in creation?
Okay, that's in Genesis and not in Exodus, so we're not opening that quick can of worms. So in Exodus 2, it switches from using God to Lord. So let me ask you the same question. We'll have to go through this a little bit quicker, but when you see that word, Lord, what comes to your mind? What does that mean?
Rule over creation.
Rule?
Rule instead of creation.
Okay. Rule instead of create. Okay. Master?
A respectful title which generalizes a concept of the specific God.
Okay.
It's a generalization. So,
Really what you're looking at is that word with the capital on there. Yeah. So you're seeing, so ruler and, okay.
So Lord has it's got a relationship attached to it. While God is just God. I mean, that's all powerful. And Lord, I see more of it as the relationship between him and something else.
Okay, so yeah, there is a servant master difference in hierarchy coming with Lord. Is that what?
Yeah.
Okay.
You couldn't be a lord if you didn't have a servant or someone beneath you, right? God
Right.
is, like what Debbie is saying, God is God, whether he made us or not. Whether there were any angels or not, God is still God.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think you could be a lord if there wasn't somebody below you.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, kind of piggyback to what Skip was saying, I've used the word authority. So there's now one authority over, where you could have creation, and the creator and creation, but it would kind of imply that the creator is better than the created, but it's not. You now have a power structure.
Okay. There's power involved there. Now, the other thing that you're going to see as you read this is not just that word, Lord, but in your English translation will be one of those two. They're all caps. Lord in all caps, either all the same font or the O-R-D still in caps, but a slightly smaller font, depending on which English translation you're doing. So the first two words, Lord, are the Hebrew word Adonai or Adon. Adonai is a emphasized Adon. So those words are related. We typically talk about it being Adonai. But when you read Lord in your English Bible is all caps, it is not Adonai. It is what scholars call the tetragrammaton, which is a big fancy word for the four letters. It is YHWH, which we believe, they think would be pronounced Yahweh or something close to that. The reason they think that is because the Jews stopped pronouncing that word in the 2nd or 3rd century before Christ, 200 to 300 BC, because that is God's name. It is holy, and we don't want to receive his wrath for us unholy people saying his holy name. They stopped saying it altogether. And instead, when they would read it, when they came to those four letters, Hebrew was originally a Coptic language. It only had the consonants and no spaces. So it was just, imagine trying to read your newspaper or book, all consonants, no spaces, no vowels. That was their written language. And so whenever they came to the YHWH in English, they would see it, but they would say Adonai. And then when they started putting in the little dots and marks, tittles, as the King James calls it, little marks and dashes, to represent vowel sounds, to remind the reader not to say Yahweh, but to say Adonai, they put the vowel sounds of Adonai with Yahweh. And when they started translating the English translations back in the 14, 15, 1600s, they looked at that and said, oh, it's Jehovah. It's not Jehovah, it's Yahweh. So when you see all caps, or all caps occasionally happens 4 times, I think, God, you'll see Lord with capital L, small O-R-D, and then God. In those 2 cases, that's actually the name Yahweh. Our God has a name. I grew up thinking his name was God. I grew up thinking his name is the Lord. Those are titles. Those are descriptions. He has a name. So what you were referring to is Exodus, the 3rd chapter. Exodus, the 3rd chapter, in verses 13 through 15. God has called Moses to the burning bush, and we'll come back and talk about that more. Question for you to think about for next week. Why would you be interested in a bush that burns for a very long time? Just think about that. Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the gods of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the gods of your fathers, the gods of Abraham, the gods of Isaac, and the gods of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. And again, this is Exodus 6, verses 2 and 3. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. God has a name. Do not use my name in vain. I don't know about you, but that means different. And when I would challenge you to read through this, and where you see that capital Lord, think or read Yahweh. It's his name. I think it will change your concept of who God is. Because instead of being just that relationship of Lord, it becomes personal. A person. Imagine if you only referred to your supervisor at work as supervisor, or you never called or boss. You never called them by name, or you never called your employees by name. You just called them by their title. How would that change that relationship? What I want you to challenge to, God, for the first time, to Moses and to the people of Israel said, all those names, Daryl did a sermon series 2 years ago on the names of God, mostly out of Genesis. But those names are not actually names, they were descriptions. El Elyon, God Most High. How do you have a God Most High if there are no other gods? You know, but going out of that story is there are other gods, but this one is the most, Abram's God is the Most High God. But that's not his name. His name is Yahweh. And I just think it will change how you understand what is actually being said here if you will go in and say, when you read this, do it like I did in those passages. I am, what you see is the Lord, but what you hear or translate to yourself, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, or El Shaddai. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. But then you can add, but to you I am making myself known by name. So, just like Abram means father, Abraham means exalted father, Hebrew names mean something. So the question then becomes, what does the name Yahweh mean? Yeah, I know, it was 2 years ago that he did that sermon series. Let me go back to what I've learned a little bit about the Hebrew. Some people tell you that the Hebrew language is actually pretty simple because it only has about 400 basic words. They call them primitive words. A language with only 400 words. That's not really true. It's 400 root words or primitive words. Most of those words are 3 Hebrew letters. But that's not an actual word. To make it a word, you add a 4th letter. But all the words that use those same 3 letters are all related. So in Hebrew, and I don't know the Hebrew well enough to just tell you what these are, but I do know that the Hebrew word for sheep and shepherd and pasture are all built on the same 3 words because they all go together. So when you take the 3 letters from the 4-letter word Yahweh, that primitive root word has to do with existence, being alive, all the words that are built off of that. And so in that phrase, where in Exodus 3, where Moses says, what's your name? And he says, I am that I am. I am. That is using that word. It has to do with existence and being and life. God is telling you, by my very name, I am life. If you really wanted to translate the word, it would be like his name is the one who exists, the one who lives, the one who is. That's what his name means. And for us, he is the source of life. And being in him is true living. Being with him is being alive, because he is life. That's his very name and nature. So a couple of minutes left. Let me ask you this question. If God revealed his name in Exodus, how is it that that name, Yahweh, appears in Exodus 2 for the first time in our Bibles? In the Garden of Eden. Because Adam and Eve did not know his name was Yahweh. Beth? Because Moses wrote those books. Yep. He did. But why would he use that name there? 2 things. One is, I have heard my sons tell their sons things that we did when they were small, that I did with my sons when they were small. And when they describe that, they do not say, Larry did this. They do not say, Dad did this. They say, Papa did this. They know me as Papa. I did not become Papa until I had grandchildren, right? But that's what they call me. That's what they know me as. So Moses is using Yahweh in Genesis before that name is revealed, because the people to whom he is writing know that's his name. The name means life, living. And what happens in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 in that story? We die because we choose our own way. We call it the fall. But what does the scripture say happens when you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? You will die. We died because we separated ourselves from the one who is life. But now he has come to bring us life. And his name is Yahweh. So as you read in Genesis, I want you to see that name. Daryl?
That's what makes the I am passages in the
Uh-huh,
Jesus is using the same language.
yeah.
We don't always pick up on that. He is the bread of life, he is the bishop.
Mm-hmm.
It's that completeness of life in human form.
And those Jews understood it because when he said those I am passages, they picked up stones to kill him because he was blaspheming, saying that he was God. Except that he wasn't blaspheming, he is God. So, yeah, well, it's one Greek word, but yeah, but they understood what he was saying. Yeah, not just the words, but the meaning. So, yeah, it's either Aramaic or Greek, yeah, but probably not. So, next week, I want to go back and look at Exodus 3 and 4, where God gives Moses some signs to prove the message. Exodus 4, specifically, Exodus 4 and Exodus 7. Thank you for being here. Appreciate your comments. And we'll look for you next week. And if you got questions, let me know. Thank you.